The inclinometer on the bulkhead was pinned at 30 degrees, and it wasn't coming back. The ship had stopped rolling comfortably and was now just lurching violently on its side. We were broadside to the weather, taking the full force of the Atlantic swell directly on the beam. The rhythmic pounding of the bow had stopped, replaced by a terrifying, chaotic motion. On the bridge, the helmsman was spinning the wheel uselessly to the left, but the ship kept turning right, carving a tight circle into the valleys of the waves. The rudder angle indicator was frozen at hard starboard. The ship was essentially paralyzed, drifting sideways, exposing her weakest flank to 40-foot waves. Down in the steering flat, the silence had been shattered by a noise like a high-pressure hose screaming. The main discharge pipe on the starboard steering ram had ruptured at the flange. Hydraulic oil, pressurized to 120 bar, was atomizing instantly into the air. It filled the room with a thick white chemical fog. The pressure dropped to 0 in seconds. The heavy steel rams, no longer held by the hydraulic lock, had allowed the force of the ocean acting on the massive rudder blade to slam the tiller arm all the way to the stops. The steel machinery groaned under the load, metal grinding against metal as the sea hammered the rudder stock from the outside. This happened in November 1988. We were crossing the North Atlantic, heading west towards Halifax on a 60,000-ton product tanker. It was the kind of night where you wedge your boots under the bunk mattress just to stay in bed. I was the second engineer. I was in the engine control room, ECR, making coffee, when the general alarm bells started ringing. They didn't pulse, they rang continuously, the signal for a steering failure. The ship took a massive roll to port, throwing me against the main switchboard. The coffee pot flew across the room and smashed against the gray steel panels. The hot liquid splashed over the instruments, steaming on the glass gauges. I grabbed the sound-powered telephone. The bridge was already shouting, "Steering failure! We are broaching! Get aft!" The chief engineer burst out of his cabin, wearing only his boiler suit and flip-flops. He didn't have time for boots. Second, get the fitter. Get to the steering flat. Isolate the pumps. Some mounts, he barked. He was holding onto the door frame to keep from falling as the deck tilted steeply under our feet. Before I tell you what we stepped into, make sure you subscribe. If you want to know how we keep these rust buckets floating when everything goes wrong, hit that button. I ran out of the ECR and headed for the tunnel. You couldn't go out on the weather deck. The waves were washing over the manifolds. I had to use the underdeck passage. It was a long, narrow steel corridor running the length of the ship. The lights were flickering because the main generator was struggling with the erratic load. I met the fitter halfway down. He was carrying a heavy canvas tool bag. We didn't speak. We just ran. The ship lurched again violently. I was thrown shoulder first into the cable trays running along the wall. The metal bracket dug into my arm, but I pushed off and kept running. The sound of the ocean was louder back here, booming against the hull plates just inches from our heads. We reached the heavy watertight door of the steering gear room. I could hear the hydraulic pumps screaming from the other side. They were cavitating, sucking air because the oil tank had emptied itself onto the floor. It sounded like gravel rattling inside a steel drum. Grr, clack, clack, grr. I undid the dogs on the watertight door. They were stiff. I had to kick the bottom one with the heel of my boot. Thud. It gave way. I spun the wheel and cracked the door open. Immediately, a fine mist of hot oil hit my face. It tasted bitter and metallic. The air was unbreathable. The visibility was less than 3 feet. The entire room was a white cloud of vaporized hydraulic fluid. "Stay low," I yelled to the fitter. We stepped over the high combing. My boot hit the deck plates and instantly slid out from under me. It was like stepping onto wet ice. I went down hard on my hip. The floor was covered in 3 inches of slippery golden hydraulic oil. It was sloshing back and forth with the roll of the ship, creating many waves of oil that crashed against the bulkheads. I scrambled to my hands and knees. The oil soaked through the knees of my boiler suit instantly. It was warm, about 50 degrees Celsius. I crawled towards the sound of the screaming pumps. I had to find the emergency stop buttons. I felt my way along the handrail. My hands were so slick I couldn't grip the steel pipe. I had to hook my elbow over it to pull myself forward. The ship rolled heavily to starboard, the bad side. The oil on the floor rushed past me, carrying loose tools and rags with it. A heavy shifting spanner slid past my head and clanged into the bulkhead behind me. It seemed impossible that we could fix a burst pipe in a room where you couldn't stand up and couldn't see, but what we found next was much worse than a leak. I reached the starter panel. I wiped the oil off the plastic buttons with my sleeve. I hit the big red stop button for pump number 1. The screaming died down. I hit the button for pump number 2. Silence. Well, not silence. The pump stopped, but the noise of the storm took over. The rudder stock, a solid steel shaft 2 feet thick, was banging against the stops. Boom, boom. Every time a wave hit the rudder outside, the tiller arm inside would jerk violently. The hydraulic rams, which are supposed to hold it steady, were empty. There was no damping. The fitter crawled up beside me. He wiped his eyes with a rag, but the rag was oily too. He pointed to the starboard side. "Look at the pipe," he shouted. The mist was settling now that the pressure was off. I shined my explosion-proof flashlight at the starboard ram. The main delivery pipe, a Kuwal 3-inch seamless steel tube, had not just cracked. It had completely sheared at the flange. The bolts were still in place, but the pipe had fatigued and snapped clean off. "We can't weld that," the fitter said, "not with this much oil in the air. One spark and this whole room explodes." He was right. The air-fuel mixture in here was perfect for a bomb. We couldn't use torches. We couldn't use grinders. I crawled over to the tank gauge. It was showing empty. We had lost 2,000 liters of oil into the bilge. Without oil, we couldn't use the hydraulic system to push the rudder back to center. We were stuck hard over. The phone on the wall buzzed. I picked it up. My hand left a greasy print on the receiver. "Second," it was the captain. "We are taking heavy damage on the deck. The lifeboat is gone. We need steering now. Can you give me midships?" "The system is empty, Captain. Pipe sheared. No hydraulics," I said. I tried to keep my voice flat, but my heart was hammering against my ribs. "Center the rudder, second," the captain said. His voice was very quiet. "If we don't head into the wind in the next 20 minutes, we are going to capsize. Center it manually." I looked at the tiller arm. It was massive, shaped like a giant key. To center it, we had to physically pull the rudder against the force of the North Atlantic Ocean. "Understood," I said. I hung up. I looked at the fitter. He was sitting in the oil, holding onto a pipe bracket to stop sliding. "We have to use the chain blocks," I said. "We have to pull it back by hand." The fitter looked at the massive tiller arm, then at the small chain blocks hanging in the corner of the room. He looked at the floor, which was deadly slippery. "If the chain snaps while we are pulling," the fitter said, "it will cut us in half." I nodded. "I know. Go get the big shackles." The ship groaned, a deep structural sound of twisting steel. We were running out of time. I tried to stand up to reach the overhead beam, but my feet slipped again, and I crashed shoulder first into the pump motor. Pain shot down my arm. I swore, spitting oil out of my mouth. This was going to be a nightmare. The fitter returned with the heavy steel shackles clanking against his chest. He was sliding more than walking, using the ship's violent roll to skid across the oily deck plates. He crashed into the mounting frame of the steering gear, breathless. The room was a death trap. The air was still thick with the white mist of atomized oil, and every surface was coated in a golden, slippery glaze. It was like trying to work inside a lubricated piston cylinder. We had to hang the chain blocks from the overhead lifting beam. This beam was 3 meters above the deck. Usually you would use a stepladder, but in a storm like this, a stepladder would just become a missile. I had to climb the hydraulic piping itself. I wiped my hands on a rag, but the rag was soaked. It was useless. I grabbed the vertical discharge pipe of the number 2 pump. It was hot to the touch. I squeezed tight, feeling the vibration of the ship through the metal, and pulled myself up. My boots scrabbled on the oily pipe, finding no grip. I had to use pure arm strength. I hooked my elbow over a flange and hauled my body up inch by inch. The oil ran down my sleeves and into my armpits. It was warm and slimy. "Throw it up," I yelled down to the fitter. He swung the heavy 5-ton chain block. It was a dense lump of iron gears and chain. I caught the hook with one hand. The weight of it nearly pulled me off the pipe. My fingers were cramping instantly. I slammed the top hook over the lifting beam. It clicked into place with a dull metal sound that was swallowed by the roar of the storm outside. I dropped back down to the deck. Splash! The oil went up my trouser legs. Now came the hard part. We had to attach the other end of the chain to the tiller arm. The tiller arm is the massive steel lever that connects the hydraulic rams to the rudder stock. It was moving unpredictably. Every time a wave hit the rudder outside, the tiller arm inside would jerk sideways. It was a 20-ton piece of steel swinging with the force of the ocean. We had to get a shackle through the emergency eye bolt on that moving target. I grabbed the lower hook of the chain block. I pulled the chain out, hand over hand. The links were greasy and cold. They made a zip sound as they ran through the block. I looked at the fitter. He was watching the tiller arm, timing its rhythm. "Wait for the lull," I said. "Don't put your hands inside the crush zone." The ship rolled hard to port. The tiller arm swung away from us, exposing the eye bolt. The fitter lunged forward. He held the heavy bow shackle in both hands. He tried to thread the pin, but the threads were clogged with paint and grease. He twisted it frantically. Creak. Boom. The ship rolled back. The tiller arm came swinging back toward him like a guillotine. "Back!" I screamed. He threw himself backward into the oil. The steel arm swept past his face, missing his nose by inches. It slammed into the hydraulic stop with a sound like a cannon shot. The deck shook under us. The fitter lay there for a second, chest heaving. He looked up at me. His face was smeared with black grease and golden oil. He didn't say anything. He just stood up, wiped the shackle pin on his shirt, and waited for the next roll. It was a terrible choice. I could see the fear in his eyes. I knew that if he slipped, or if the rudder swung early, he would be crushed between the arm and the ram cylinder. But if we didn't secure that chain, the ship would capsize. I nodded at him to try again. I sent a man into the crush zone. "What would you have done?" This time he got it. He spun the pin home just as the arm started to move. He dove clear. The chain snapped taut. Twang. The heavy steel links vibrated like a guitar string. "Haul!" I shouted. We both grabbed the hand chain. We pulled in rhythm. Clack, clack, clack. The gears inside the block ground together. We were fighting the ocean now. The chain tightened until it was bar tight. Water started squeezing out of the twisted strands of the chain from the pressure. My gloves were ruined, so I was pulling with bare hands. The steel bit into my palms. I could feel blisters forming and bursting in the same minute. The salt sweat from my forehead ran into my eyes, stinging like acid. "It's moving," the fitter grunted. Slowly, agonizingly, the rudder angle indicator on the wall began to twitch. 35 degrees, 30 degrees, 25 degrees. We were pulling the ship out of the death turn. The violent rolling began to ease slightly as the bow started to point back into the wind. The motion changed from a chaotic corkscrew to a predictable pitch. We had it centered, 0 degrees. "Tie it off," I yelled. "Lash it." We scrambled to secure the hand chain so the block wouldn't slip. We looked at each other. We were covered in oil, bleeding from the knuckles and exhausted, but we had done it. The rudder was amidships. Then the ocean decided it wasn't finished with us. The ship rose up on a massive rogue swell. I felt the deck lift under my feet, going up and up elevator style. Then the bow dropped into the trough. The stern kicked up. The rudder was exposed to the full force of a following sea. A massive green wave slammed into the rudder blade from the starboard quarter. The sound inside the steering flat was sickening. It wasn't a bang. It was the sound of steel failing. Ping, crack. The 5-ton chain block didn't break. The heavy steel hook straightened out. It peeled open like a banana. The chain whipped across the room with the speed of a bullet. It slashed through the air, missing my head, and smashed the fluorescent light fixture on the ceiling. Glass rained down on us. The tiller arm, released from the tension, slammed back to hard starboard instantly. The ship lurched violently. I was thrown across the room, sliding on the oil, until I hit the watertight door. The fitter was thrown into the corner. The darkness was sudden. The only light now came from my flashlight, which was rolling on the floor, casting crazy, spinning shadows against the oil mist. The rudder was back at hard starboard. The ship began to broach again. The rolling returned, worse than before. I crawled over to the fitter. He was holding his ribs. "Broken?" I asked. "Cracked, maybe," he wheezed. "The hook failed, second. The load is too high. Chains won't hold it." He was right. The dynamic load of the waves hitting the rudder was peaking at maybe 50 or 60 tons. Our 5-ton chain blocks were toys. We had false hope. We thought muscle could beat the Atlantic, but we were wrong. I looked at the hydraulic rams. They were the only things strong enough to hold the rudder, but the pipe was sheared. The oil just pumped out onto the floor every time we tried to use them. The system was an open loop. It couldn't build pressure. The phone rang in the dark. I didn't want to answer it. I knew what the captain was going to say. I crawled to it anyway. "Second," the captain's voice was high-pitched now. "We are rolling 40 degrees. The cargo is shifting. What is happening down there?" "Chain block failed. Hook straightened out," I said. My voice sounded hollow. "Fix it," he screamed. "We have maybe 10 minutes before the main engine cuts out on low oil pressure due to the angle. If we lose the engine, we are dead. Give me steering." I hung up. I shined the flashlight around the room. The beam cut through the oil fog. It landed on the broken pipe. The jagged edge of the steel was mocking us. We couldn't weld it. We couldn't clamp it. The pressure was 120 bar. It would blow any rubber patch we tried. We needed the hydraulic rams to work. We needed to push oil into that cylinder and lock it there. But the delivery line was gone. I looked at the floor. Among the tools sliding in the oil, I saw a pile of high-pressure hoses we used for the portable energetic pump. They were mismatched, different sizes. I looked at the frantic motion of the tiller arm. It was smashing against the stops. Bang, bang. "Fitter," I said, "we can't hold it with chains. We have to use the hydraulics." "Pipe is broken, boss," he coughed, clutching his side. "Oil is on the floor." "I know," I said. I felt a strange calm settle over me. It was that feeling you get when you run out of options and only the crazy ones are left. "We're going to bypass the main pumps. We're going to hotwire the hydraulics." "How?" he asked. "We don't have the fittings." "We're going to cannibalize the deck machinery," I said. "We need the hoses from the mooring winches, and we are going to cross-connect the port pump to the starboard ram." "That's not possible," the fitter said. "The threads are different, imperial and metric." "Then we force them," I said, "or we sink." The ship groaned, a long, deep vibration that shuddered through the hull. The angle was getting steeper. We were running out of time. We didn't just need a repair. We needed a miracle of plumbing, and we had to build it in the dark, sliding on oil, while the ship tried to kill us. The MacGyver solution wasn't pretty. It was ugly, dangerous, and technically illegal. But the ocean doesn't care about regulations. We needed to bypass the sheared main pipe entirely. I remembered seeing a coil of spare high-pressure cargo hose in the bosun's store, the kind used for the portable framing pump. It was rated for 150 bar. It was rubber, flexible, and long enough to reach from the port side pump to the starboard ram. "Watch the rudder," I yelled to the fitter. I scrambled out of the steering flat, sliding on the oil like a skater, and sprinted down the alleyway to the bosun's store. I grabbed the hose. It was heavy, reinforced with steel braiding inside the rubber. It smelled of old hydraulic fluid and mold. I threw it over my shoulder. Now I needed fittings. I raided the engine room workshop. Junk. Box. A rusty tin bucket where we threw old brass fittings, reducers, and nipples. I dug through the oily brass like a raccoon. I found a 1-inch to 3/4-inch reducer. The threads were wrong. NPT tapered instead of BSP parallel. I ran back to the steering flat. The fitter was still on the floor, groaning. The ship was rolling so hard now that the bilge water alarm was screaming in the background, adding to the cacophony. "We're going to cross-connect," I said, dropping the heavy hose into the oil. "We take pressure from the port pump. We feed it directly into the starboard ram's air vent port. The air vent port is a small hole on top of the cylinder used to bleed air. It wasn't designed for full flow. It was tiny, but it was the only hole on the cylinder side of the brake. I crawled onto the massive steel block of the starboard ram. It was moving, jerking with the waves. I had to time my movements. Jerk, pause, jerk. I put a wrench on the air vent plug. It was painted over. I hammered the wrench with my palm. Bang! It broke free. I unscrewed it. A jet of oil shot out, hitting me in the chest. Now for the hard part. The hose fitting was 1 inch. The hole was 3 or 4 inch, and the threads didn't match. I looked at the fitter. He handed me the biggest pipe wrench we had, a 36-inch Stilson. It weighed 20 pounds. Its jaws were like alligator teeth. "It won't fit," the fitter wheezed. "It will if I make it fit," I said. I took the brass reducer. I lined it up with the steel hole. It didn't want to go in. The threads clashed. I grabbed the giant wrench. I clamped it onto the brass fitting. "Hold the hose!" I shouted. I put my weight on the wrench. I pushed. The brass screamed, a high-pitched scree, as I forced the tapered thread into the parallel hole. I was cutting new threads by brute force, destroying the fitting to create a seal. Cross-threading is nature's Loctite. If you turn it hard enough, the metal deforms and fuses together. My boots were slipping on the oily ram. I wrapped my leg around a pipe to anchor myself. I pulled on the wrench with both hands. Crunch, crunch. The fitting went in deep. I could feel the heat generating in the metal from the friction. My boiler suit was soaked in sweat and oil. My muscles were trembling spasmodic shakes from the adrenaline dump. "That's it," I gasped. "Connect the other end." The fitter dragged the hose to the port pump. He screwed the other end into the test gauge point. That one fit perfectly. Click, spin, tighten. We now had a rubber hose draped across the room, bypassing the shattered steel pipe. It looked ridiculous, a garden hose trying to steer a supertanker. "Clear the area," I yelled. "If this hose bursts, it will take your head off." We scrambled behind the pump motors, using the heavy electric motors as shields. I reached out with a broom handle I found in the corner and poked the start button on the port pump. Whirr! The electric motor spun up. The rubber hose jumped. It stiffened instantly, becoming as hard as a steel bar. It writhed on the floor like a snake as the pressure hit it. 100 bar, 110 bar. I watched the brass fitting I had forced into the cylinder. A fine mist of oil sprayed out from the threads, but it didn't blow out. The cross-threading was holding. "Look at the ram!" the fitter shouted. I looked. The massive steel piston, which had been dead for 20 minutes, started to creep. It was moving, slowly, so slowly, but it was moving. The hydraulic fluid was forcing its way through the narrow 3/4-inch restriction, pushing the 20-ton tiller arm. Creak, groan. The rudder angle indicator on the wall twitched, hard starboard to 30 degrees, 25 degrees. The ship felt it. The violent, chaotic rolling changed. The bow was biting into the water again. The stern stopped sliding. We were coming into the wind. I grabbed the phone. Bridge, you have rudder control. Do not go hard over. Gentle movements only. We are running on a rubber hose. Copy that second. The captain's voice was shaky. Heading is stabilizing. We are bringing her into the wind. Good work. We didn't celebrate. We just sat there in the puddle of oil, watching that rubber hose vibrate. Every time the rudder moved, the hose pulsed. It was the only thing keeping us from capsizing. I looked at the fitter. He was pale, holding his ribs, but he was grinning. His teeth were white against his oil-blackened face. It's leaking, he pointed to my MacGyver fitting. Let it leak, I said. I wiped my face, smearing more grease across my eyes. As long as it doesn't blow. We sat there for 12 hours. We couldn't leave. We had to top up the hydraulic tank with buckets of oil because the leak was losing about a liter every 10 minutes. We formed a bucket chain. I would run to the storage tank, fill a bucket, slide across the floor, and pour it into the pump reservoir. The fitter watched the hose. If it started to bulge, we would have to hit the emergency stop. The storm raged all night. The ship pitched and slammed, but she was head to weather now. She could take the punishment. The rudder held steady at midships. That cross-threaded brass fitting, stripped and deformed, held back the entire Atlantic Ocean. By morning, the sea state had dropped. The sun came up, gray and cold. The chief engineer finally came down to relieve us. He looked at the room. It was a disaster zone. Broken glass, a straightened steel hook, tools scattered everywhere, and inches of oil on the deck. He looked at the rubber hose draped across the machinery. He looked at the brass fitting jammed into the cylinder block. He just shook his head and tapped the pressure gauge with his fingernail. Permanent temporary repair, the chief said. Classic. We limped into Halifax 3 days later. The pilot refused to board the ship because of our steering status, so we had to be towed in by 3 tugs. When the shoreside repair team came aboard, guys in clean coveralls with fancy laser alignment tools, they took one look at the steering flat and asked if we had had an explosion. When I showed the foreman the brass fitting, he turned white. You put 120 bar through a cross-threaded brass reducer? He asked. Well, that's a bomb. It's not a bomb, I told him, peeling off my oil-soaked gloves for the last time that trip. It's a rudder. We spent the next week in port. They had to cut out the damaged section of the cylinder block because I had destroyed the threads so badly they couldn't be retapped. They had to machine a new insert. The company wasn't happy about the bill, but the captain bought me and the fitter a bottle of whiskey each. He knew the alternative was explaining to the insurance company why the ship was upside down at the bottom of the Grand Banks. I still have that brass fitting. I kept it after they cut it out. It sits on my desk at home, a little monument to brute force and ignorance. The threads are completely stripped, flattened into smooth metal. It reminds me that sometimes when the manual says replace part and the ocean says die, you have to throw the book away and trust your hands. That night in the North Atlantic changed how I looked at engineering. It wasn't about math anymore. It was about survival. It was about the weight of the tool in your hand and the will to make it work. So have you ever had to fix something using a part that definitely wasn't supposed to fit? Have you ever cross-threaded something on purpose to save the day? Tell me your MacGyver stories in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more sea stories.